Hi, friends. Welcome to the Genesis of Shame podcast. I'm your host, Sam Landa, and I'm here to help you speak biblical truth to the shame you experience in relationships. My hope is that you grow in your understanding of how shame impacts you so you can learn how to connect with God and others. If you've experienced fear, hiding who you are, boundary issues, anxiety, and/or depression in your relationships, then this podcast is for you. It's time to speak truth to your shame.
Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Genesis of Shame podcast. We are having a great discussion today on fear and shame. And I have a very special guest, and she is a great writer, author of On Reading Well. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But specifically, we're also going to be addressing an article that Dr. Pryor wrote and how fear and shame is associated to that or to just writing in general. So I'm really looking forward to it. Dr. Karen Pryor, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's
Absolutely.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, this is one of those topics where I think as we explore, it's really difficult for people to touch on these topics, but specifically fear and shame. Now, in your writing, I'm sure, and reading of many, many books, I'm sure that comes up as part of the themes in those books. Is there anything that just kind of stands out to you right now when we talk about just fear and shame? Any books or anything in your writing career that stands out?
Well, one of my favorite novels that I love to read and to teach is called Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and it's by Thomas Hardy, a 19th century novel that essentially it centers around a situation that today we would call date rape. Of course, it wasn't called that in the 19th century, but it's a complicated situation with a young girl who's innocent and pure and is taken advantage of, and then it follows the rest of her life. And I have found in teaching that novel today to students, especially in a Christian environment, that it really taps into a lot of issues of shame, particularly around sexuality. But also, that topic touches so many other areas of our lives. And so that's a particular work of literature that I love to read, I love to teach. And that even though it's, almost 200 years old, it provides a fruitful discussion for today around these topics.
How do students engage that topic? Because I'm guessing that when it is brought up, that there's a lot of emotions rising from that. And I can imagine it being very difficult to even try to have a discussion around it. How do you channel all that energy into a good, fruitful discussion?
Well, of course, it's, I teach in literature classes, so we're looking at the text and how the writer writes and his craft. And so that helps keep us focused. But of course, it ends up delving into all kinds of areas that, students don't necessarily share personal things in the classroom, but they do share how little these things seem to have changed over time, because the novel deals with the double standard, the way the man who took advantage of the woman doesn't suffer the same kinds of severe consequences that the woman does. And so it's just a great work to talk about things that still, that have been going on throughout human history and still go on today. Yet it's a way of talking about them in a way that's not super personal, because we're looking at another situation that's fictional and a long time ago. And it's a great way to talk about things that are still important.
Yeah, and as a teacher, I'm sure you have to kind of make sure that they don't veer off into maybe cultural issues, or I don't know, is that integrated into the classroom at all?
Actually, that's one of the ways that I teach literature is
Okay.
that I try to show students how even an 18th or 19th century novel still applies to today, how the things that that's what makes great literature great, is the fact that even though it's in a particular time and particular place, it reveals universal truths about human experience and the human condition. So I'm all about making connections to the culture today.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm guessing that part of that is maybe what led to, or maybe you could give some background on what led to the writing of that article about Christian virtue and ethics, right? Having good character over these many, many rules to follow, right? And it was controversial, I guess, in a way. But really, you're sharing that if a person has good virtue, then those other things are secondary or aren't at the forefront of everyone's minds. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that statement?
Sure, sure. The article that I wrote had to do with kind of a principle that has become a rule for many in ministry to follow, that I think, sort of thoughtlessly, just sort of assuming that a principle applied by one person is then becomes a rule for everyone else, which is something
Mm,
that, in Christianity we tend to do,
sure.
find things outside the Bible and make them, almost like gospel. And so I think the connection between that great work of literature and this topic that I was writing about is that, because both the Tess of the D'Urbervilles is about, the author even says, a virtuous woman,
Mm,
and he calls her, she lost her virginity through basically rape, and in her society that made her unvirtuous. People would
mm,
consider her lacking in virtue simply because she no longer had her virginity, and the fact that it wasn't her will, that it wasn't her intention, that she didn't know what was happening, that wasn't her fault, those things didn't really matter in her society. And
mm,
so it's a great, that novel and what I was writing about in that article, even though it's, kind of a very different angle, has to do with how important character is, more so than our surrounding circumstances or following a rule, because you can follow rules and not disobey them and still have very bad character. You can do the
it's
right
true.
thing for the wrong reasons, or you can do something that ends up being wrong without intending to, or without realizing that, you can just not not follow a rule that you didn't know was there.
Hmm.
And so that taps into, I think, a lot of, the issues of fear and shame that we're talking about today.
Yeah, yeah, and it's interesting too because I remember when all that happened. I don't know if I think it was attached to the Me Too movement a little bit, but there was a big part in there where Pence was getting critiqued for having that role. And it sounds like for the most part, anyone, whether it be in ministry or leadership or something, that rule is established for protection, right? For protection of, I don't want people to have something to say about me in this specific situation. But even with that, he was still criticized. Or if he did meet with someone, then he'd be criticized for that. Oh, how are you doing that? And I think that's the fear surrounding it. You do talk about an experience where you were finished a meeting, and then you were leaving that meeting, and then a situation came up where that kind of came into play. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure, sure. It was this, a work meeting at one end of our workplace, and our offices were, a good 15 or 20-minute walk away. And so, because I had driven to the meeting, I just asked a colleague if, he wanted to ride back to our offices, and it got suddenly awkward, and he declined, and I had no idea that he, and he didn't say, to his credit, he didn't say, "Oh, I follow this rule," because I think that's where the criticism of the vice president came in, is like, you can have rules and principles that you follow because you think that they are wise, but when you start announcing them and making them public, then it suddenly becomes something else. But anyway, so in this situation, all of a sudden, I just felt very awkward because something that wasn't sexual at all suddenly
Hmm.
turned sexual, because an offer of a ride became, some boundary that I had crossed, or he would cross if he took it, and it just seemed very needless to me.
Hmm.
um and it just kind of opened up for me the whole problem with these kinds of rules that are, I think, easier to follow than to actually just developing good character.
Yeah, and how does that, I guess, how does that come into play for both sexes? So for the man, what should be a guideline that he should follow in these situations? And for a woman also, what should be a guideline, I guess, that she would follow?
Well, I think, first of all, as Christians, the scriptures are pretty clear that we are to treat fellow believers as brothers and sisters in the
Right.
Lord. And so I think if we begin with treating people of the opposite sex as brothers and sisters, then that eliminates a lot. We just make a decision. Would I take a ride with my sister? Would I take a ride with my brother? Now,
Mm-hmm.
if in following that biblical principle, you discover that you have some weakness, or, you know,
Mm.
there's some sort of a stumbling block for you, then of course you need to respond. But
Great.
the default position should be, this is a brother and a sister, and I will treat them as such.
Right.
Uh, and then we apply other principles as, you know, as problems occur.
Okay. And that same principle applies to both, either male or
Mhm.
female.
Yeah, exactly. Now,
Yeah.
of course, there are also other workplace, you know, factors that we have to take into consideration, and
Mm-hmm.
realities of the world, such as, you know, false accusations, or,
Mm-hmm.
the appearance of impropriety. And it's so easy to address those, which is why, you know, for example, in educational settings, all offices have windows, and you leave the doors open if they don't have windows. And I mean, I remember when I first, you know, a number of years ago, when I was an administrator, and I had to instruct the faculty under me to take some of them were covering up their windows with posters and paper. And I said,
Mm.
you know, you have that there's a
Right.
reason why those windows are there.
Mm-hmm.
And so of course there are, you know, there are things that we can do that are common sense, that don't make other people feel like sexual objects or temptations, or as though they are not brothers or sisters, or our students, or our colleagues.
Mm-hmm. What do you see as the prime driving fear for most people in these types of situations?
Well, you know, I think I want to offer a slightly different perspective. In
Okay.
my experience, I don't think fear even comes into play in most of the time.
Mm-hmm.
I think that many people adopt these rules or these guidelines without thinking about them,
Mm-hmm.
almost as a form of virtue signaling, or as a form of, oh, this is what good pastors do, or this is what good Christians do. And they've never even necessarily been in a situation that they fear, or, you know, have faced a challenge. They just think that this rule is one that every good Christian, or every good pastor, or every good leader follows regardless. And
Mm-hmm.
and so they haven't really thought about it. It may not, I mean, if we go back to the origins of the rule, with Billy Graham,
Mm-hmm.
his reason for doing it, I mean, and his situation was, he was traveling all around the world without his wife, meeting strangers that he didn't even necessarily need to spend time with, and so set up this rule for himself to follow
Mm-hmm.
that made sense in his particular situation.
Mm-hmm.
When he never meant it to be for every
Sure.
man, every Christian man to follow. And so I think a lot of people have just, and this is how it ties into lack of true virtue and character. If we just simply follow a rule that doesn't apply to us, or one that we haven't even thought about, we've just mistaken this rule for virtue,
Mm-hmm.
that's where it becomes a problem.
Gotcha.
And
Mm-hmm.
of course, and so I think that fear doesn't really enter in oftentimes, or does enter in later. I think in some respects, it's not so much fear that's the source as it is pride in being someone who follows this rule, or who announces this false virtue, as a way of, you know, of announcing their, you know, their uh position. And yeah, so
Sure.
I think many times pride is the problem, more so than fear.
Okay. So at the end of it all, when you wrote that article, I mean, did you receive any backlash, or kind of what was the conversation afterwards?
Oh, sure. I received a lot. I received a lot of backlash. Again,
Yeah.
a lot of what what I've already said is drawn from some of the backlash that I received,
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes from pastors, who I could tell hadn't really thought about the ramifications of this rule, and really did seem to hold to it as sort of a matter of pride and virtue. I would argue false virtue. And again, I don't even necessarily have a problem I mean, of course we need to use wisdom, and we need to, again, the offices, the windows in the office, and but there's almost no there's a rule that without necessarily having wisdom and prudence in the
Sure.
rules, because there's obviously a huge difference between grabbing a cup of coffee or lunch at work with a colleague to discuss work
Hmm.
and going out to a candlelight dinner after
Right.
work, right? And
Sure.
so I was seeing very few people make distinctions about about those kinds of situations. They are like night and day. And so I've seen people who think, well, of course I wouldn't go out to a candlelight dinner after work with my
Hmm.
colleague, um, who then just would also all of a sudden just not grab coffee or lunch at the workplace.
Hmm.
So there's just a real lack of prudence and wisdom in failing to make those distinctions. I've
Yeah.
seen a lot of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you touched on this earlier as well, kind of the lack of awareness too. So, for example, one of the things, there was a report last year, I think it was from the Southern Baptist Association, where it started to expose basically all these situations where women in the church were mistreated, abused by elders, pastors, and so on. And the story was always the same. Person has issues, pastor has issues with his wife, or leader has issues with his wife. Woman over here has issues with her husband. They start spending time together, and then that rolls into this whole situation of power abuse and new relationship, and kind of this putting into the mind of the person that this is God's will. And I'm just thinking to myself, how, who would say that? Like, how could you get to that point of saying that? The awareness factor comes into play when, okay, how am I feeling? Kind of like what you were saying. How am I feeling about this situation? If I'm feeling attracted when I know that I'm not on good terms with my wife, this is probably not a good idea. I should probably move away from this. But it's drawn more. The two situations push these two people together, and it just makes a whole mess of confusion with biblical principles and just proper relationship between brothers and sisters in Christ. And so I wasn't shocked by the report. I think I was more shocked by how often the pattern is the same.
Mm-hmm.
It's so similar.
And it would be interesting to know how many of the pastors involved in those abuses and affairs follow the Billy Graham rule. Exception when they were about to have an affair,
Right.
because you can develop affections and attractions to people that you work with every day without being alone in the office with them.
Mm-hmm.
So the Billy Graham rule doesn't protect against the very
Those
thing that
specific
it's supposed
situations.
to. Right.
Exactly. In your experience, both writing and just professionally, how do we tackle this? I mean, what would be your guiding principle or insight about how we as brothers and sisters in Christ can address this?
Well, I think that there is in American evangelicalism a kind of romanticism, where we tend to separate out the physical and the spiritual. We tend to see things in
Mm,
terms of ideals, like something is either really good or really bad, and we don't see kind of the shades of gray. So I think that we have, essentially, this is what romanticism does, is it gives us unrealistic expectations about ourselves, about other people, about our marriages, about faith, our very faith. And so that leaves us ill prepared to grapple with temptation, failure, weakness. And so rather than sort of own the weakness, own our ability to fail, we run from anything that might lead. We hide ourselves from the
mm,
possibility of failure. We protect
yeah.
ourselves, we shield ourselves, as you've talked about, because of that fear. When and that actually, I think, can end up leading to the more likely to the thing that we're
Mm,
trying to run away from, because we don't, because again, to go back to my beloved topic of virtue,
hmm.
classically the definition of virtue is the moderation between two excesses,
Mm,
between two extremes, an
yeah.
excess and a deficiency. So anytime that we we run from too far from one thing to one end, we're bound to just to make an error in the opposite direction. And all of the virtues show this. Like, so if we for example, if we take the virtue of courage, courage is the moderation between cowardice and rashness. um
Mm.
so if we often think of cowardice and we think, well, I don't want to be a coward, but if we go too far in the other direction, we become rash, which is actually dangerous. We couldn't cause harm to ourselves and other people when we don't balance respectful coward, like having respect for
Mhm.
dangers and not respecting dangers. There's a great
Mm.
quote that I use in my book in the chapter on courage, that comes from Herman Melville's novel Moby Dick, and he says, basically the character there says, "I'll have no man on my ship who isn't afraid of a whale." This is a
Mm.
whaling ship. You've got to be afraid of the whales if you're going to whale. So yes, we
Mm.
need to have respect for our emotions, our sexuality, our sinfulness. But we also are supposed to go whaling. We're also, we're not, if
Mm.
we go on the ship, but we respect so we're supposed to have the connections that you talked about, have the human connections, know
Mhm.
our frailties, know our weaknesses, but not use those to be as excuses to run away from just simply being human and connecting with other people. That's exactly what virtue is, moving ourselves toward that tension, that balance between truth and love, and
Mhm.
between law and grace.
Mhm. And we avoid it because it's uncomfortable. It
Mhm.
feels weird, right? Not doing what we're used to.
Mhm. And it's also just hard. It is
Yeah,
much
it's true.
easier to be, to live in the black and white and to
It's
be
true.
extreme. It's much easier. You don't have to think. You don't have to grapple. You just, that's what fundamentalism is, on the left and the right, right? I mean,
Mm.
there are fundamentalists on either side.
Yeah, yeah. So you've seen that too, where it's just either my way or the highway type thing, right? It's
Right.
this way or nothing at all.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder, I always try to think about what drives that. I wonder if it's just life experience itself, like it's just what I'm used to. Like if you grew up in a fundamentalist church, that's just what I'm used to. Or if you grew up or didn't grow up Christian and then you came to the Lord later on, maybe that's a factor as well. So a lot of little things like that. Um, but yeah, any other writings that you've done or books that you've read that kind of touch on this topic? I really like the first one that you had mentioned because that one obviously plays very much into our culture today.
Mhm.
But any other ones?
Well, one that this one is, I don't necessarily expect people to go out and read it. It's a
Mhm.
very, like, you'd have to be a crazy English major to want to read this 18th century novel. It's like 900 pages long, but it's a
Mhm.
book called The History of Tom Jones, and it's about a young man who's kind of a scoundrel. He's got a good heart, but he lacks any discipline and virtue, and he goes on all these escapades. And at the beginning of the story, his guardian tells him, you must seek prudence and religion, and then there's this long tale of him making these mistakes and finding his way, and finally in the end kind of finding that virtuous middle.
Mm.
And so that's just a funny story. But I would say, another novel that might be more familiar to a lot of people or novelists is Jane Austen.
Yeah.
Even though her books are always about love and marriage, that's really just the surface level, because underneath it all, she's really writing about virtue. She's
Hmm.
writing about kind of figuring out what your particular weaknesses are,
Hmm.
and correcting them. Like, Sense and Sensibility is a story of two sisters, one who is entirely, and by the way, the film captures this too, so if you want to cheat and
Yeah.
watch the film, it's fine. But one sister is all reason, she's all sense, and she's
Mm.
not emotional, and the other sister is all emotion, she's sensibility. And the story is about how the two of them, they need to learn, like the sensible one needs to have a little more emotion, and the emotional one needs to have a little bit more sense. And so it's a
Mm-hmm.
delightful story about finding that that virtuous mean between the two extremes.
Wow, that's great. Yeah, and I love that too because it does make you wrestle with the realities of life because not everything is on either side. Usually there's a lot in the middle that we just wrestle through, try to figure it out. You know, being in the counseling realm, I would think that, or anyone would think that, oh, I would have the answer to, oh, here's attachment theory and here's how it applies to my kids. And when I'm seeing it play out, I don't see it work out the way I have it in my mind. And then I start wrestling with that. How does this actually work? So yeah, when I started the podcast, there was a lot of self-doubt. You know, is this going to bless people? Is this going to be something that's effective? Will people be able to take something from this and learn and improve their relationships? And then I started thinking about, as a writer as well, there's a lot of self-doubt. I mean, am I communicating the message that I want to communicate it? Can I do it clear? Tell us a little bit about kind of the writer's journey.
Mm, that's a good question. What I was earlier about romanticism, which is that idea of an idealism that's unattainable, and so perfectionism would be an example of that.
Mm,
And you know, as someone who teaches writing to students, I encounter that a lot. I encounter students um, who who will would rather just not write or do anything because it has to be perfect for them,
yeah.
or they won't
Mm,
do it at all. We all know about perfectionism, and I have very high standards for myself, for
mhm,
my work and for other people, but I'm not a perfectionist because that's completely unrealistic. So I think there's a kind of
mm,
humility and realism that comes in when you say, you know, I'm going to do the best job I can. I'm going to work very hard at it. I'm going to write the best thing that I can. But I know that there will be sentences or points that I could have
mm,
communicated better. There will be misunderstandings. There will be criticism. And so going into it knowing that, refusing to be a perfectionist because I deliberately and intentionally want to live in the human realm,
mm.
which is not perfect, but
Mhm,
still wanting to do what God has called us to do, which is to do good work and do the best we can and to improve and to work hard at it. Then I go in accepting, knowing that it will not be perfect. I will make it as best as I can, and hopefully I will learn from each error or weakness that I do and improve over time.
so if someone counters maybe an argument that you made on an article, do you respond through the comments or do you write a follow-up article to clarify?
Well, I mean, there are different ways of doing that. I mean, sometimes you know, comments can, you know, on the article can work, although fewer places are having those now because they tend to be so destructive. Most of the feedback I get would be on social media, particularly Twitter, and I do tend
Mm.
to engage with people a lot, probably more than I should, but I'm a teacher, so for me it's all,
Right.
you know, it's all
That's true.
dialogical. I'm like, I
Yes,
can't, you know, it's like on Twitter someone raising their hand and me as a teacher ignoring them. um
that's true.
it's so it's
That's a good
hard to
point.
shut that off. So I respond and engage, and it has to do with, for me, writing is dialogical. I write
Mm,
because I'm learning, and I want to continue to learn, and I want to teach others. And so for me, getting sharpening and criticism and feedback is part of that process. It's part of why I do what I do. It's not that I want to put
mm,
something out there that's perfect in the final word. I'm not, you know, I'm more humble than that. And so
mm.
you know, I want to continue to learn and improve, and I get that from feedback.
Mm, yeah, that's great. So as teachers, we're always learning, right?
Right.
I'm always reminded of this professor who said, someone asked him a question and he said, you know what? I don't know. And that to me was so offensive because I thought, you're the teacher, you should know. And then as I started teaching, I'm like, I don't
Oh,
know everything,
right.
you know? And I think that's
Mm,
the whole journey, is that I don't know everything, but I can figure it out. And I'll go and find out what the
mm,
answer is, and then we can continue the dialogue. But that was a very um, eye-opening experience, just reminding me that if I'm going to pursue teaching, then I need to know
mhm.
that I don't know everything, right?
Exactly. If
And
only the rest of the world would figure that out too.
right, and that we can learn from our students, right?
Right.
That when they share stuff, it, oh yeah, I never thought about that. I may not agree, but at least it gives me something to think about, and then we continue the conversation that way. But but yeah, I mean, Dr. Power, thank you for being on the show. I do want to give um give you some time to talk about your book, On Reading Well. And I know you talked about how it deals with the virtue of ethics. Can you give us a summary for my audience as they think about it? So I'll add the link in my my podcast episode.
Great, sure. So in my book on Reading Well, it is about great works of literature that I love to read and teach, but it's also about virtue. So even if you aren't too sure about the literature part, the whole introduction talks about what virtue is and gives a number of definitions and explanations. And then each chapter is focused on a different virtue, like courage, like humility, like patience, kindness, love. And so I'm not, I draw on a long tradition of wisdom from philosophers and theologians in applying these virtues to the works of literature. So I've written it really for people who don't know anything about virtue ethics, and also who don't know these works of literature, just as kind of an invitation to think more, not only about these works of literature, but about virtue in our everyday lives.
That's great. Yeah. And I know that there was a lot of people, I think, did you come to Liberty to kind of, were you at the Barnes & Noble bookstore for that?
Yes, for a book signing. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So you were there for the book signing. So I know that you have a very positive influence with a lot of your students. I've met many of them, and I know they're going to be excited about this episode. And I just want to thank you again just for coming on the show. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Well, thank you for having me. It was an honor.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Pryor.
Thank you.
Thank you again for tuning in today, guys. I really appreciate it. Your support means a lot to me, and I really look forward to doing these each and every week. If you would like to continue supporting the podcast, one of the things you can do is go to your Apple Podcast and find the Genesis of Shame there, and then subscribe to it. That really helps Sig get some traction on the iTunes podcast and will allow this to be heard by many more people. You can also follow me on Spotify and other major podcast platforms. Thank you again, guys. Have a great day.